love you more.
There is a new sadness around the world this morning. This shot that you just saw is live Eastern Time, 7 o'clock this morning, outside the Dakota. That's an apartment building on Central Park West in New York City. John Lennon, the former Beatle, was murdered in front of his apartment late last night. And during this hour, we will talk with some of the people who knew John Lennon well. We'll talk about his life, about his unique contribution to music, to our culture, to our times. In a few minutes, we will start by talking with a man who conducted the final interview with John Lennon. That was just yesterday afternoon, a long discussion for radio, and we will talk with the man who conducted the interview. I am David Hartman with Stephanie Edwards. John Lennon taking the week off, and this is Tuesday, and this is the 9th of December.
We'll also talk to Pat Collins, who will be speaking with some of the people who've conducted an all-night vigil outside the Dakota, those who love John Lennon and his work. And John Coleman will be with us this morning, of course, with news of the weather.
Minute after 7 right now. Let's go right to Steve Bell in Washington and learn more. Steve?
Good morning, everyone. A 25-year-old man described by New York police as a wacko and a screwball has been charged with murder in the shooting death of John Lennon. Witnesses say he fired 5 shots point blank at the rock star, then put down his small handgun and waited for police to arrive. Rita Sands has the story.
Lennon was coming home from a late-night recording session accompanied by his wife, Yoko Ono, when the attack occurred. Police say the assailant shouted Lennon's name before running up behind him with a .38 caliber revolver. At least 5 shots were fired, inflicting 7 wounds, 2 in the arm, 2 in the leg. But the 3 wounds to the chest did the most damage. Lennon stumbled up the steps into the apartment house, declaring, "I've been shot," before he fell face down in an office area, his wife looking on horrified. The suspect in custody is identified as 25-year-old Mark David Chapman from Hawaii. Police say he'd been in the New York area for about a week, apparently stalking Lennon, hanging out at Lennon's apartment house over the weekend, asking for the former Beatle. The two met briefly earlier in the evening when Chapman asked Lennon to autograph a record album. Lennon complied. Action to save Lennon's life was quick but fruitless. Though he was rushed to Roosevelt Hospital in the back of a police car, Lennon was dead on arrival. Ironically, the record album just released by Lennon showed him and his wife standing in front of the Dakota apartment building where he was to meet his death.
Overnight, hundreds of mourners gathered at the Dakota to pay tribute to Lennon, some of them placing flowers right here at the site where Lennon was gunned down. When the candlelight vigil began, someone shouted, "John would not have wanted us to be so solemn," and that's when the singing of Lennon's songs began. Beyond the sadness and the confusion over his death, this has become a celebration of the man and his music. Steve?
And finally, from She Loves You to Abbey Road and beyond, the Beatles were the dominant force in pop music for 2 decades. And of the foursome, John Lennon appeared both the most clever and controversial. Geraldo Rivera looks back.
John Lennon, without a doubt, was one of the most important musicians of our time. A man of unlimited energy and talent, he was a force that overlapped the world of rock and roll and affected the attitudes and style of a whole generation of people. He, along with Paul McCartney, were the real cornerstones of the Beatles, the creators of an evolution in rock music. They were the heirs to Elvis Presley and the forerunners of everything that's followed, whether it's punk music or the mellow sound of rock and roll. John and Paul wrote most of the 250 million records the Beatles sold. During the early 70s, the Beatles, like the country, went through incredible individual changes. John and Paul had both decided to go it on their own. The decision, which was based on real personal as well as the professional consideration, shocked millions of us. Just as they had captured and commanded a fantastic audience with the group, now they wanted to do the same thing. In the words of John Lennon, they wanted to do it in their own right. They went back to work in the early 70s, John and Yoko did, but then they went into seclusion, during which time John lived the melancholy life of a man who temporarily, at least, was going through a personality crisis. For a time, he found himself right in the middle of rock and roll's fast lane. But they got through it, and John was starting over. He had a new record album recorded just 2 months ago. It was a good album that was receiving general public acceptance. John Lennon was back until an assassin ended the life of this fantastic talent, a man who changed the history of rock and roll.
And that's our news to this hour. David?
Thank you, John. Jack Anderson will not be with us this morning. He'll be back in his regular spot tomorrow. As you have heard, John Lennon, the former Beatle, is dead this morning. Last night, hundreds of the people who loved him and his work conducted an all-night vigil outside the Lennon home in New York. Pat Collins is there this morning. Pat.
Thank you, Stephanie. The circumstances are vastly different, but in many ways the death of John Lennon is reminiscent of the death of Elvis Presley. When Presley died, the fans immediately converged on the Graceland Mansion, and much the same thing is happening here in New York at the Dakota apartment building where John Lennon lived. Behind me, the iron gates of the Dakota that separates the street from the inner courtyard. As you may see, the gates are ready with bouquets of flowers, other notes of expressing sympathy, and newspaper headlines being tacked on the gate. On the other side, young fans playing on the cassette players Beatle tunes from the 60s and the 70s. And all around us, hundreds of people. During the night there were thousands, and many of them went away, but now hundreds are reconverging here in the spot. Some of the young people here all night for this spontaneous vigil to John Lennon. Kevin, you've been here all night, and you came. Why?
I guess we really just came for spiritual reasons, just to pay some kind of respect to the repose of the soul of somebody who affected us and many different generations of American and people all over the world, really.
How did he affect you? How did his music affect you?
Well, as he said, you know, it affected many generations of different ages of people. And even though when I was growing up, he was, you know, there were, like, I was small when they were really, you know, hitting it really big. It still, you know, it still affected me because of the peaceful way they came on with the music, especially John Lennon, in the sense of he brought a lot of peace to people. He was a peaceful man, definitely.
Tim, a lot of people consider John Lennon a poet in many ways of the 60s. Was he that for you to do? Was there something in his music that he said that meant something special to you?
I could identify very much with the feelings that he expressed in his music, and I'm in horror right now with the whole thing. I've been here all night, and it's still hard to accept.
Tim, like many young and not so young fans here all night, and we will be here with you the rest of the morning at the Dakota apartment buildings. Stephanie?
Thank you, Pat. We'll be back with the reporter who just yesterday conducted the final interview with John Lennon after this.